Hello YouTube. Today I'd like to discuss the final part of Robert Nozick's book Anarchy, State and Utopia. Now this part hasn't been nearly as influential as the first two parts, but I think there are a lot of interesting ideas here. So in this part, Nozick provides a model of utopia, and he argues that libertarianism is the closest possible realization of this model in the real world. Nozick has argued in the first two parts of the book that only the minimal state is morally justified. See my video on libertarianism and distributive justice for a discussion of one of Nozick's central arguments for this. So only the minimal state is justified, and this is a state that provides only basic services like police, courts and military defence. The minimal state permits citizens to do whatever they want, provided they don't harm others. But Nozick worries that many people might find the minimal state to be lackluster, precisely because it's so minimal. Nozick asks, who would be inspired to struggle or to sacrifice for this state? Who would man the barricades under its banner? I mean, when you read other political theories, they often provide very inspiring visions, and Nozick worries that libertarianism, it might seem, doesn't. So, in response to this, Nozick argues that actually the libertarian minimal state is a framework for utopia. The minimal state, Nozick says, is the one that best realises the utopian aspirations of untold dreamers and visionaries. So actually the minimal state is an inspiring utopian vision. Okay then, so first of all, utopia. Well, utopia, I guess, traditionally is conceived as a kind of ideal society, a society that possesses the best qualities for all its citizens. We should all want to live in utopia. And utopian writers, I think, often imagine this society as a kind of static end state, maybe a final state to which society is progressing. So no radical change should happen in utopia because, you know, utopia can't be improved, right? Utopia is the best possible society, so any fundamental change would be detrimental or at least neutral. Now, of course, utopia is often used as a pejorative term. We sometimes say that a political philosophy is utopian if it is impossible, impractical, idealistic, unconcerned with the facts about the real world. Any political philosophy that proposes radical changes, as libertarianism does, risks being utopian in this sense. You know, it risks being completely impractical. And I think implicit in this kind of criticism is the thought that many attempts to realise a particular vision of utopia have been totally disastrous, resulting in something very far from utopia. Look at how, you know, the French Revolution degenerated into the Reign of Terror. You know, and in the same way, many people worry that libertarianism, far from liberating people, would simply transfer power to the super rich and to corporations, and we'd end up with something more like feudalism. So, you know, there are plenty of arguments that libertarianism is utopian in this pejorative sense, but Nozick wants to put libertarianism in the utopian tradition as an inspiring ideal. So for him, libertarianism as utopia is one of the major arguments for libertarianism. Okay, anyway, so yeah, what is utopia? Well, utopia is the best possible world, the best world we can imagine, and Nozick models utopia, or he provides a kind of model of utopia in terms of possible worlds. So he says, suppose that people had the power to create worlds and their inhabitants just by imagining them. So there's a process where worlds are created simply by being imagined. And once an individual has created a world, she can either stay in that world or can create a new one and move away to the new one. And similarly, the inhabitants of her world can either stay in that world or imagine their own worlds and move away. So what Nozick says is that a utopian world is a stable world. And a world is stable if it is such that all of its inhabitants choose to remain within it. If everybody chooses to remain in the world, then nobody in that world can imagine any other world that they would rather inhabit and that they believe would continue to exist if all of the other inhabitants also had the power to create new worlds. The inhabitants of a stable world judge it to be the best world available for them. No better world can be imagined, at least no better world that would continue to exist for any length of time. So stability is necessary and sufficient for utopia. A world is utopian if and only if it is stable. What does this model tell us about utopia? Well, utopia is often thought of as the best world in general, the best world for everybody, right? That's the kind of classic idea of utopia, transforming the whole of society into the best possible world. But for Nozick, it's clear that utopia is really a collection of many different worlds. It's a collection of many different utopias, each of which is the best possible world for everybody living in that world. Everybody is different, so there is no best possible world for everybody. The world in which I would most want to live may not be the world in which you would most want to live. So there are different utopias for different people. And it's worth making explicit that one reason why there are many utopias in this model is that in this model, worlds are judged by internal standards. A utopian world is a world that is best according to the standards and preferences of the people living in that world. The question is, can anybody in the world imagine a world in which they would rather live? So utopia is a place where people actually want to live, rather than a place that realises some sort of objective good or is best according to objective standards or whatever. A world is utopian, if it's a place where people want to be. So it's about what people want. Some people will want to engage in harmful activities, and in their utopia they will be able to do so. And you might say that there's something, sort of objectively speaking, they're not living the best life they could live or something like that. You might say that's not really a good life. A life where somebody takes loads of drugs, for example, is not really a good life. But if that's what they want to do, then their utopia will be a world where they can do that. And one benefit of conceiving of utopia in this way is that there's no longer any need to engage in any kind of theorising about what counts as an objectively good life. We just ask for people's explicit preferences. Now, with that said, there is an important limitation on the kinds of worlds that are possible in Nozick's model. Nozick distinguishes three conceptions of utopia: existentialist, missionary, and imperialist. Existentialist utopians simply hope that a particular kind of social and political structure will exist, though they have no desire for it to exist universally. They're happy for other people to live in different types of societies if they want to. So existentialist utopians just want a particular kind of society for themselves. Missionary utopians think that their favoured structure would be best for everybody, and they hope to convince everybody to adopt it. They hope that their favoured structure would be universally accepted, but only through voluntary means, through argument and persuasion. Finally, imperialist utopians want to impose their favoured structure on everybody and will use force if necessary. Nozick's model obviously rules out imperialist utopias, so that the model privileges the non-coercive utopias. And you might wonder if this maybe harms Nozick's analysis, because the model is supposed to be neutral. It's not supposed to privilege any particular conception of the good life. The point of the model is supposed to be that it takes no stance on what makes something the best possible world. It allows each person to decide this for themselves. But now, in fact, it seems that we do need to rule out some preferences as illegitimate. We can't allow people to be imperialists. In fact, the model doesn't allow people to be imperialists. So what Nozick says to this is, well, you can't satisfy everybody, especially if there are people who will be dissatisfied unless we realise a condition such as an imperialistic utopia that will leave other people dissatisfied. The model allows imperialists to create the social structure that would be best for them. It just doesn't allow them to impose that structure on others. So I guess one way to look at it is that utopia is about the political structure of a world, not about how that world relates to other worlds. Ralph Bader, in his article The Framework for Utopia, puts the point this way. He says we can distinguish between self-regarding and other-regarding preferences. Self-regarding preferences are my desires for myself, my desires concerning what happens to me. Other-regarding preferences are my desires for how other people should act or should be. Now, utopian communities are judged according to the preferences of their members, but one constraint on this is that the kind of preferences we consider need to be co-satisfiable. It's not possible to satisfy both the self-regarding and the other-regarding preferences of all people. If we were to allow people to be imperialists, then the self-regarding preferences of other people would be violated by the imperialist activities. So this is the rationale for judging communities only by the self-regarding preferences of their members. It is possible to satisfy the self-regarding preferences of all people. It's not possible to satisfy the other-regarding preferences of all people. And so that's why the imperialist utopias get sort of ruled out. They're not possible on Nozick's model. Okay, anyway, so that's Nozick's model of a framework for utopia. And the next step is to ask if there's any way we might apply this model to the real world. Well, obviously, we can't create worlds just by imagining them, but we can create and join communities of people. And members of those communities can either stay with us or leave and join another community or create their own community. In the real world, people form all kinds of different communities. And in this way, although Nozick's model is highly idealized, we can apply it to the real world. Just as stable worlds are utopian worlds, stable communities are utopian communities. So stable community is a community wherein none of the members can imagine an alternative community in which they would rather live and that they would expect to be stable. And a community is utopian if and only if it is stable. So we end up then, as in the model, we end up with a variety of different utopian communities corresponding to the different preferences of the members. So the real world framework for utopia would be a political system wherein different communities can be set up, people can choose which community to inhabit, and where no restrictions are imposed on the lifestyles of different communities beyond the fact that people can't be coerced to remain in them. So as long as it's voluntary what community you're in, it's fine what the community does, right? The state doesn't impose any further restrictions on what the community does. And this, Nozick says, is just the libertarian minimal state. It's a state that provides protection against violence and theft and fraud and enforces contracts, but beyond that it allows people to live and to interact with each other as they see fit. So notice that then the minimal state is not itself the utopia, rather it's a framework for utopia. It's the political system which allows endless forms of utopian communities to exist. In the possible worlds model, people create utopian worlds. In the minimal state, people create utopian communities. Under the libertarian minimal state, Nozick says, utopian experimentation can be tried, different styles of life can be lived, and alternative visions of the good can be individually or jointly pursued. Now, obviously, in the real world, it's very unlikely that the members of a given community will be completely satisfied with every aspect of it, that they will be unable to imagine a better community. There's bound to be compromise. So we may never realise a perfect utopia, but the key point is that there will be a variety of communities, some more attractive to a given individual than others. People will tend to form communities that best realise their desires. And since, of course, we have a diversity of desires, we will settle into different communities. There's a kind of free market of communities, where each community competes for members. Niche communities will develop for those with more unusual tastes, but you'll be able to find the best life for you, or at least something close to the best life for you. Now, in the minimal state, of course, you can choose your preferred community, but you can't choose your preferred framework, right? Every community has to abide by the rules set down by the minimal state. And I mean, inevitably, every possible framework, every possible state will impose itself on those people who prefer a different framework. There's no way around that, even in principle. But as we noted in Nozick's model, imperialistic utopias are ruled out. For Nozick, an imperialistic utopia would violate utopia because it would impose itself on people who would prefer to live in a different world. People who have different visions of utopia. So in the real world, we need a state to prevent that from happening. So that's the sort of point of having a state. The minimal state prevents imperialistic utopias from imposing themselves on non-consenting people. The minimal state just has the role of ensuring that people are free to start their own communities, just as in the model they can leave worlds by imagining new ones. So the minimal state ensures the operation of the utopian framework. Now, the model itself might be ideal, but Nozick grants that obviously it can't be fully realised, let's say. He says that the minimal state is only a pale projection of the model. And that, of course, raises the question of why we would sort of assume that this is necessarily the best arrangement for real-world humans. I mean, after all, maybe something very different from the ideal would be better in the real world than a near miss of the ideal. So we might all grant that yes, if we could live in Nozick's model of utopia, that would be the best possible world for everybody. That would be the best situation for everybody. But maybe in the real world, we shouldn't really worry about this kind of ideal theorizing, and actually something very far from the ideal might be best. So Nozick presents 4 reasons to think that no, the minimal state really is the best option, that a kind of near miss of the model should still be inspiring, because actually the minimal state still retains the important features of the model. So first of all, the minimal state, like the model of utopia, respects the fact that people are different. They have different values and different weightings for the values they share. There is not one kind of community that is best for everyone. A utopia cannot be a single community, but needs to be a variety of different communities, and that's what we get in the minimal state. Second, not all goods can be realised simultaneously. Trade-offs must be made. For instance, a person might value life expectancy, but they also enjoy doing various risky activities, let's say. I mean, a hedonist might want to engage in lots of drugs and other risky behaviours, but also wants to do this for as long as possible. So obviously risky behaviours will tend to reduce life expectancy, so we'll need to trade off one against the other. No unique system of trade-offs would be suitable for everybody, even if they shared the same goals. In a world with a variety of different communities, each individual can choose the community that best approximates his own preferred trade-offs among values. Actually, this seems to be kind of a restatement of the first point, because I would assume that different trade-offs is just an aspect of the fact that people have different values, but Nozick presents it as separate. As a third defence of the minimal state, Nozick distinguishes between design devices and filter devices. So suppose that the utopian tradition is correct and that one kind of society is best for everybody. How could we find out what this society would be like? Well, of course, many utopian authors have tried to design their utopia. A design process involves explicitly describing what something will be like without necessarily constructing other things of its type. Think of an architect creating a blueprint for a building. The blueprint will specify the construction materials, the height, where the rooms are placed and so on. It will just sort of tell you what the building is going to look like, and it tells you what the building will look like without telling you anything about any other buildings. So the design utopian just sits down and tries to provide a blueprint of what their society will look like. The problem with this method is that societies are extremely complex, and any policy will have various unintended and unforeseeable consequences. And this is why attempts to actually realise a vision of utopia always fail so miserably. You can't design it. Even if utopian theorists were right that there is an ideal society best for everybody, you wouldn't be able to find it by design. And in fact, even if some brilliant genius did come along and somehow create a blueprint for an ideal society, nobody would have the confidence that it would actually work out. But this doesn't mean that we have to give up on utopia, because we can instead use a filter device. Filter devices involve a process which eliminates options from a range of alternatives. Natural selection is the classic example of a filtering process. In natural selection, change happens over many generations because each generation has organisms with a range of heritable characteristics, but only some organisms survive and reproduce, so only some of the characteristics are passed on. This results in organisms that are well adapted to their environment. Similarly, if we have limited knowledge of our desired end product, we can use a filter device to achieve it. The minimal state allows people to design their own communities, but then it creates a filtering process through the competition between different communities. Some communities will wither and die, some will split, some will flourish and be duplicated. New communities based on new ideas will arise, all of this depending on how well the communities satisfy various people's desires. So it's essentially a natural selection of communities which will lead to communities that are adapted to their members' desires. The libertarian minimal state may be a pale projection of utopia, but it retains this important feature of a filter device. If you give people the freedom to do so, they will create communities better and better suited to their needs. The way to find the best community for everybody, if there is one, is just to let communities compete with each other freely. So it's worth noting that one interesting feature of Nozick's vision for utopia is that it allows for change, right? I mean, people will keep on generating new communities as they imagine better ways of organising society or as their standards change. For Nozick, the framework for utopia is a process rather than a particular kind of state. It's not a final end state. A community may be utopian at one time, but then things will change. People might decide they want to leave. So this is quite different from the traditional utopian theorising, which envisions utopia as a kind of perfect final end state. Okay, finally, the fourth path to the minimal state is that the minimal state can function as a common ground for all utopian theorists. People who have very different visions of utopia could cooperate on realising a minimal state because this provides each of them with the framework for realising their own utopian visions. The minimal state is compatible with all utopian visions without guaranteeing any specific one. And Nozick says any utopian should consider this a great virtue of the minimal state, because if the state imposed a particular vision of utopia, it may not be their own. So a key point about the minimal state is it does not privilege any particular vision of the good life. It simply provides enough institutional structure to ensure that all interactions are voluntary, which allows people to pursue their own ends. And in that sense, the minimal state is neutral. Any state that is more than minimal will impose some conception of the good life onto its people. It will privilege certain conceptions of utopia. A more than minimal state must impose restrictions on how voluntary communities can behave. And in that situation, there will be people who might prefer to move to a voluntary community not subject to such restrictions. The more than minimal state therefore prevents the realisation of communities that are best for all of the members. There's an important corollary to this, which is that any more than minimal state that is accidentally compatible with a utopia will, for that utopia, function as no more than a minimal state. It will not do anything beyond minimal state activities, so all the non-minimal activities will be redundant for that utopia. For example, suppose we add to the minimal state a law prohibiting drug use. So we now have a state which is more than minimal in virtue of prohibiting drugs. Now take a community in which none of the members want to be associated with drug use, a community where everybody's chosen to be teetotal. In this situation, the more than minimal state is compatible with the utopia, but notice the more than minimal state functions for this utopia as a minimal state. The restrictions it imposes are irrelevant here because nobody in this community wants to belong to a community without such restrictions. The community has sort of already imposed the restrictions on themselves. So any utopian then, no matter what their particular view of what utopia would be like, should agree that the minimal state framework would be appropriate for a society of good, uncorrupted, rational people. A society of good, rational people would choose the social organisation that she favours voluntarily. And in such a utopia, any expansion of the minimal state would simply be pointless because the community would already voluntarily be adhering to those further restrictions that a more than minimal state would impose. Okay, so for all these reasons, Nozick thinks that the minimal state preserves the important features of the model and serves as an ideal to which everybody can aspire. And this is quite a novel conception of libertarianism. I guess that people who are otherwise attracted to libertarianism will find it inspiring anyway, but Nozick tries to show that even people who have very different values should treat the minimal state as a kind of ideal. Okay, anyway, so that's Nozick's view of libertarianism as utopia, or at least as a framework for utopia, let's turn to some problems with his analysis. Okay, a first set of concerns about Nozick's argument arises from his theoretical model of utopia. Some people may feel that regardless of whether the minimal state is the best way to realise this model, actually the model is just the wrong way to think about utopia in the first place. So it's just irrelevant that the minimal state is the best realisation of this model. One objection to Nozick's model is that it's too permissive. It permits repugnant communities. The model allows worlds of Nazis and radical Islamists, and those worlds would be utopias. They would count as utopians for anybody who's a Nazi or a radical Islamist. And of course this arises from the fact that Nozick explicitly designs his model to be value neutral in the sense that it doesn't make any prior judgments about what counts as a good life or a good society. There are absolutely no constraints on what a utopian community can be like, beyond the fact that its members, don't sort of impose themselves on other people. So that's something that can't happen in the model. Projecting this into the real world, under the minimal state you might have a community of Nazis living over the hill, and provided they're not actually initiating aggression against everybody, they can promote their hateful ideologies, and for Nozick that's part of the process of utopia. The fact that society allows this is something to feel inspired by. So I guess one aspect of this objection is simply practical. So I'm sure you're familiar with the idea that a tolerant society must not tolerate the intolerant, because if you allow intolerant ideas to be promoted, then these intolerant communities will grow in power and may eventually destroy the tolerant society. So the minimal state may be kind of captured and undermined. Now obviously a libertarian can question whether prohibition would actually stop the spread of dangerous ideas, or whether there might be other ways of dealing with dangerous ideas and so on. But I mean, there's a problem of principle here. Would we say, even if you agree with the libertarian that people should be allowed to be Nazis, would you say that a world containing such communities counts as any kind of utopia? I mean, even libertarians who support the right of such communities to exist will often find them repugnant and will find them very far from ideal. And indeed, I think one of the key ideas of libertarianism is the thought that people should have the right to do plenty of things that are very bad or very offensive. People should have the right to do things that other people hate. And actually that idea in itself is perhaps in tension with utopian theorizing. The idea that people should have the right to do things that are awful there's some tension there with the notion of utopia. So, which of course raises the question of whether a libertarian would even want to be promoting their views as being a kind of utopia. So one objection to Nozick's model is that it's just too permissive, that it's just ridiculous to count a world of Nazis as being any kind of utopia. A second concern about the utopian model, recall that the point of this discussion of utopia is that Nozick wanted to show why people would, as he says, man the barricades for the minimal state. He wants to show why the minimal state can be an inspiring vision. But it seems that what people will man the barricades for are their own communities, not the minimal state framework. What most people will find inspiring will be the way of life promoted by their chosen community. So recall that in the model, the utopia is not the model itself, rather each world is a utopia for the inhabitants of that world. Nobody need be inspired by the model itself. And so, projecting that onto the real world, nobody need be inspired by the minimal state that realises the model. People would be inspired by their own communities. Indeed, for people who are not attracted to libertarianism, the minimal state will, from their point of view, seem very unjust. They'd probably view it as forcing its ideals on society. For example, the fact that the minimal state allows substantial wealth inequalities, or allows people to pursue their own desires no matter how base and hedonistic. A very religious person who feels that the government should encourage adherence to chastity and modesty, why would they be inspired by the minimal state? Yes, the minimal state allows their religious community to exist, but surely they'd be inspired by their community, not by the minimal state. So arguably then the kind of model that Nozick introduces here just doesn't address the problem that he's intending to solve. It's just sort of irrelevant. Okay, so even if we accept Nozick's model of utopia, another way to object to his argument is that the minimal state is too much state. A better realization of the model would involve a smaller state or no state at all. So notice actually that even if it's successful, what Nozick's argument really shows is that the minimal state is, I guess, the maximal institutional structure compatible with this model of utopia. But more minimal structures will also be compatible. In fact, in the model itself, there is no state, there is no central framework. There are just the many different worlds. And so the anarchist may say that the minimal state goes too far, right? Actually, a minimal state will interfere with the operation of many possible communities. Chandran Kukathas, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but in his article E Pluribus Plurum, points out that even a minimal state is going to interfere with communities. So consider communities that exist at a subsistence level and do not produce surplus goods, like hunter-gatherer societies. These kinds of communities couldn't exist under a minimal state because they wouldn't be able to produce the surplus required to pay the taxes that a minimal state would levy. Now, of course, it might be suggested that, the way the tax system would work is that people would only pay the taxes if they're earning above a particular rate. But then it seems like the minimal state is still going to need to ensure that that not everybody prefers a subsistence community, right? The state's going to need to ensure that there are enough productive communities, to generate the kind of tax income sufficient to maintain the minimal state. There are enough communities producing enough of a surplus to maintain the minimal state. And so the minimal state is no longer neutral about the kind of lifestyles that citizens can lead. There needs to be enough people being productive enough to support the minimal state. Furthermore, as simply an administrative matter, the minimal state may need to standardize communities in order to calculate wealth of each individual and to collect taxes. Taxation requires mechanisms for determining how much each person must pay and then extracting that payment, and that's likely going to require imposing conformity on communities rather than encouraging experimentation. So even if a community produces like a surplus, it might not have anything like our money. For instance, the people of the island of Yap use money known as rye stones, and these are a few thousand massive stone discs which are too large to move. So the transaction involving a stone is simply recorded in oral history. The value of a stone depends on its size, its craftsmanship, and also its history. Obviously, it would be tricky to tax a community with this kind of currency. Presumably, you'd have to take products, maybe, rather than currency, like maybe you take some of the food they produce or something. But again, it's tricky to do that fairly. A state will tend to prefer a standardized currency system. Now, a possible response to this is just to note that, as Nozick has already accepted, the minimal state is not a perfect realization of the utopian model, but only a pale projection of it. It's the closest we can come to realizing utopia, and that should be inspiring enough. The reason why we need a minimal state is that in the real world, communities interact, and we need something to prevent imperialistic communities from imposing themselves by force on other communities. So yes, by having a minimal state, we are compromising the framework for utopia, but without a minimal state, the framework would probably end up being compromised even more severely, and there would be nothing to ensure that communities remain voluntary. So, probably the most powerful objections to Nozick's argument here is that the minimal state is too minimal to realise his model. In order to realise the model, we need a more than minimal state. One way in which a more than minimal state may be a better realisation of the utopian model concerns education. Actually, this point is raised by Nozick himself. Children need to be educated about the range of alternative communities around the world so that they can make an informed decision about how they would like to live. Obviously, if somebody's brought up in a community and they're never told about alternative ways of life, then the utopian process just won't be able to take place. And actually, arguably, we also need to make sure that children are informed properly about what the facts of the world are. So if children were taught, for example, that homosexuality causes AIDS, that would prevent them from making informed decisions, about what kinds of communities they would like to be part of. So now it seems that actually the state is required to impose and help to deliver a particular educational curriculum. Society has a positive responsibility to provide children with an education, and that goes beyond the responsibilities of a minimal state. A second way in which we might need to expand the state. So Nozick imagines that competition among different communities vying for the allegiance of people will lead us to the best communities, will lead to progress over time as people form communities that best satisfy their desires. But libertarianism, as we know, allows for very substantial inequality. What if the richer communities simply, buy up the poorer ones? An imperialist community need not impose itself by violence. It can actually do so through voluntary exchanges that are permitted by libertarianism. So one community might have a better lifestyle for many people, but nobody will want to live there because a richer community has used various non-coercive tactics to undermine it. For example, let's say there's a rich, large community that disagrees strongly with drug use, and then there's a smaller community that indulges in lots of drugs. And so this large community just refuses to trade with the smaller drug community. And then the larger community pays other communities to stop trading with the drug community. And then the larger community pays people living in the drug community to leave the drug community. They pay drug users to join communities where drugs will be prohibited. This is all voluntary. The minimal state can't intervene in any of this. But obviously the result is that we have a serious perversion, serious deviance from Nozick's ideal model. And this point, I think, is especially difficult given Nozick's response to the previous objection from the anarchist. Remember, the anarchist objects that the model does not include any kind of centralized state, there are just different worlds. And Nozick says, well, in the real world, we need a centralized state, we need a minimal state because in the real world, communities interact. The state is required in order to prevent imperialist communities forcing their values on others. But then surely the state should also intervene in order to protect smaller, poorer communities from this kind of non-coercive predation. I mean, this would seem to be like if the state intervened so as to protect poorer communities from that kind of predation, that would seem to be a better realization of the model in practice. Okay, a final problem concerns creation costs and travel costs. In Nozick's utopian model, there are no creation costs or travel costs. You simply imagine a new world and then you go there. In the real world, it takes enormous time, money and effort to set up a new community. It would be incredibly risky to leave a community that you consider reasonable to try to set up a new one that you think might be better. In general, creating a new community is something that will be possible only for the very rich. Furthermore, travel costs are often prohibitive. Even if your ideal community has already been set up and is flourishing, what if it's halfway around the country and you just have no money to get there? In this context, many communities will be stable, not because their members can find nowhere better to go, but because the members just won't have the funding to leave. Poor people will be stuck. The kind of massive inequality that is permitted by libertarianism will tend to stifle experimentation with communities. It will prevent people from finding communities that are best for them. A state which engages in some wealth redistribution in order to provide people funding to help them create communities and leave communities would, it seems, better realise the utopian model than the minimal state. Surely a key feature of the utopian model is the fact that the people have the ability to easily move from one world to another. People can just, you just imagine the world and then you go there, right? That's surely a key feature of this model. But that is something that it seems may not be preserved under a minimal state. So Nozick does offer a limited response to this problem. He considers cases where a community's values change. Let's say you've entered a community and you've made many contributions to it, but then they bring in a new rule which changes its character. You may have a reasonable grievance about this. He suggests that people would, when joining a community, enter a contract that any member will be compensated for deviations from the community's values. Of course, nobody would be forced to sign such contracts, but Nozick expects that most communities would do this. So when I enter the libertine community, which promotes all kinds of sexual deviance, I will be compensated if they decide to ban public sex. And I can then use this money to fund leaving the community. So actually travel costs wouldn't really be a big deal. Again, this is very limited. I don't think this is a very convincing response. Firstly, I think it's questionable whether there would actually be such contracts. After all, communities inevitably change. They inevitably will have to introduce new rules over time. It seems rather ridiculous for them to offer a contract that people will be compensated for any changes in the rules. But more importantly, even if such contracts were common, this doesn't address cases where a person selects a community that they think they will like and they just end up disliking it. I mean, it's a common enough thing where you think you're going to enjoy something, but you try it, it doesn't work out for you. Or maybe somebody is part of a community for a long time and they do like it, but then their values change. Again, they're not going to get any compensation for this. So creation costs and travel costs, I think, are a bit of a problem. Right, well that was all I wanted to talk about today. So that's Nozick's argument for libertarianism as a kind of realization of a model of utopia. And that's all. Goodbye.